I'm Stephen Kishpaugh, Assistant Sports Editor to the Lantern. Joining me as always, we have Casey Smith, Lantern TV Sports Producer, Jacob Benge, Sports Editor to the Lantern, and Gabe Burggraf, Assistant Lantern TV Sports Producer. Gentlemen, Week 11, very interesting game for Ohio State football last week, but, of course, before we delve into that and the men's basketball game last night, first, just a quick word around Ohio State athletics. The aforementioned men's basketball team beat Robert Morris in its season opener, 91-53. Redshirt senior Justice Sewing led the way with 20 points. And the number 14 ranked women's basketball team hosts number 5 Tennessee tonight, and we'll have the coverage for you on that. For the soccer teams, the men's soccer team received the number 3 seed in the Big Ten tournament, defeated Michigan State 1-0, and now face number 2 Rutgers Wednesday in Piscataway. The teams played to a 2-2 draw in their September 30th meeting. And then for the women's soccer team, they earned an at-large bid in the NCAA tournament and host Bucknell November 11th at Jesse Owens Memorial. It's the first time since 2017 that the women's soccer team is hosting an NCAA tournament game, and Ohio State has a program record of 7-3-2 at NCAA tournament games at Jesse Owens. And then finally for the wrestling team, they captured 8 individual titles at the Michigan State Open, and they opened the season Friday at 7 p.m. Against number 15 Virginia Tech. They come in ranked the number 4 wrestling team in the country. And then be sure to follow Lantern Sports on Twitter and the Lantern OSU on all social media for coverage on Ohio State athletics from us and the rest of our talented writers and staff. So, guys, last night, we can talk about this briefly so Gabe can spread his propaganda. Last night, Ohio State's men's basketball defeated Robert Morris pretty soundly, I'd say. 13 different players saw game action. Eugene Brown III was the only one who missed. But we saw a lot. And, Gabe, you had something. What did you see from the game last night that you really liked?
Well, I mean, in the stand-up last night, you talked about the youth. And one particular guy played really well, Bryce Sensabaugh, forward freshman guard. I texted Casey after the game, just the fluidity of his motion. He had a rough first half, but once he got into it, I told him he kind of reminds me of a blend of 2 players because he attacks the rim a lot, and he's very vertical with his energy, and that reminds me a lot of the play around the rim, not necessarily the force in dunking the ball, but finishing with layups of Zion Williamson, while also having some of those ball handling abilities you see in a guard like Jaylen Brown. So I thought those 2 really stood out to me because he had a couple turnovers, a couple bad passes early, but once he settled in, he really controlled in transition and in the half court really well and dictated what he wanted. And one mid-range jumper in the second half, and then, of course, 2-on-1, throwing one down in the second half, I believe from Roddy Gale, another freshman. But it just shows what this freshman class can do, especially potentially with him at the pinnacle of it.
Yeah, I've been saying it for a while. Bryce Sensabaugh is someone that Chris Holtmann likes and Ohio State likes. And really, I've said it to you guys, but if Ohio State was going to have one this season, Bryce Sensabaugh may be this season's Malachi Branham if he were to go one and done and have a season like Malachi Branham did. And we all recall how Malachi Branham really turned it on in the second half of the season once Big Ten play really got going, and he got the rhythm of college and Big Ten basketball underneath him. But Bryce Sensabaugh is the tallest freshman among Ohio State's incoming first years. He's got the size to him, and Chris Holtmann has long said he shoots like Dwayne Washington Jr., and I think we all remember how Dwayne played when he donned scarlet and gray. So if he's that aggressive scoring-wise, and we'll see how quickly he adjusts to how college basketball plays at this level in the Big Ten and whatnot. But Ohio State really likes Sensabaugh.
Yeah, there was just one defensive possession I remember where it was in transition. Robert Morris is pulling it up the floor, and Sensabaugh loses track of his defender, and he's wide open in the corner for 3. He misses it, though. But I think that was kind of part of what Chris Holtmann was getting at. He said there were some things that maybe people that were just watching the game missed, some of those head-scratching moments that the freshmen will have. And that was one that kind of stood out to me, just sort of that transition to the pace of college basketball that they'll start to pick up here in the next couple games, especially with Charleston Southern on Thursday.
Yeah, I agree. And, we saw a lot of different lineups from Chris Holtmann during that game. We saw, a lot of we saw the starting lineup, and Justice Sewing was able to find his first bit of playing time since November of last year against Niagara. But we also saw stuff from Tanner Holden, the transfer guard from Wright State. And then, in my opinion, the guy who stood out to me the most last night was the Oklahoma State transfer, Isaac Likely. He just filled up the stat sheet. Even though he only had 9 points, off the top of my head, he had 6 rebounds, 5 assists, 2 steals, and a block to go along with those 9 points. So he was very busy on both the offensive and defensive ends, and he's kind of the guy I'm going to keep my eye on for the rest of the season because I just really like how hard he plays, and I really like just how team-oriented his play seems to be. He's not looking to just drive to the basket himself every time. He's looking for the best play for Ohio State to put them in the best position to win.
Right. He and Bruce Thornton will make for a good 1-2 combo in that Ohio State backcourt for sure.
So moving on from the basketball aspect of athletics, we had a very busy weekend in college football, to say the least. That Northwestern game, I personally was not there, so I cannot attest to how the conditions were, but you three were there. And even though Ohio State, it was not the prettiest win by any means, but they got it done, and that's more than teams like Tennessee or Georgia or Tennessee, Clemson, or Alabama can say.
So about those conditions, the famous app Be Real just so happened to put their notification out as we were on the field in the first quarter, and so my Be Real was a selfie of my face. My hair looked terrible. My face was dripping wet. And obviously, the forward-facing was the field, just to kind of set the scene. And my caption was, "Can confirm it's rainy and windy." So it was just absolutely miserable conditions. And coming back to Columbus, I kind of had some sinus congestion issues just from the really crappy weather that was up in Northwestern and Evanston. I believe from the research I did, I saw there were sustained winds of at least 20 miles an hour for the entire duration of the game, with a gust topping out at 47. I saw a tweet from the it was referencing the NOAA about a gust that was upwards of 80 miles an hour. They almost had to delay it because there was a severe threat in the area, and after that passed through, you could see the dark clouds. The conditions were not conducive to playing Ohio State's best football just because of the aerial attack that they present. But, that's no excuse not to be able to get it done on the ground. And, if you're Ohio State sitting at 8-0 versus a Northwestern team that's 1-7 and on a 7-game losing streak, just an absolutely inferior opponent, you should be able to bully them and quite literally push them into the mud and really establish that run game. With Mayan Williams. I would have liked to see a little bit more of Dallin Hayden as well. And I kind of liked what Ohio State was doing, sort of in the misdirection with C.J. Stroud on the keepers and then Emeka Egbuka on the end around.
Yeah, I was watching that. So when I was watching that game from home, I was taking in all of the factors. You guys were telling me just how bad the weather was. And obviously I kind of expected that to affect Ohio State because – these are humans playing a human game, and it's not like we have perfect footballing machines out there playing college football. Obviously, you have to factor in a lot. But although I knew that the wind and, just the conditions in general weren't favorable to Ohio State, the fact of the matter is that Northwestern also had to play in those conditions. And even though they didn't score after the first quarter, they were consistently matching the Buckeyes physically. They converted more third downs than Ohio State. They had more total offensive yards than Ohio State. Yeah, Ohio State came out with the win, but, it kind of looked like there was a lot left to be desired.
Well, while the weather wasn't conducive maybe for Ohio State's passing game, I thought really Mayan Williams was able to get it done. I believe he had 2 touchdowns himself. But I think we saw a different element of C.J. Stroud's game that a lot of people have been clamoring for over quite some time, honestly, more than a year since he became a starter. Honestly, a lot of people wanted to see C.J. Stroud turn on the wheels a little bit, posted a career high. He broke off a 44-yard run there that set up Ohio State's goal line stand to get its insurance touchdown, if you will, to go up 21-7. I think the big topic of the day really comes out as C.J. Stroud. A lot of people are going to talk about career low passing yards, less than 100, almost about the same amount as rushing yards there, but he still was able to guide Ohio State to victory, just like you would expect a Heisman Trophy candidate would. Just like how Ryan Day said that, C.J. Stroud was there when Ohio State faced a fourth quarter deficit at Penn State. It's just something that he brings to the table off the field, it sounds like.
So, Jacob, you're talking so much about his running ability, and it played a big factor against Northwestern. do you think Ohio State should have a little bit more of that quarterback run game and incorporated in their offense, kind of like with guys that you saw, Braxton Miller, J.T. Barrett, Justin Fields, obviously. Do you think that should be part of Ohio State's offensive attack just to keep, defensive ends honest, and you can't have the corners. I believe C.J. Stroud was saying on that 4th and 1 pull that he had for how many ever yards that he went for. He said he read the corner, and the corner was coming off the edge trying to take away Mayan, and that's when he pulled it. So if teams are breaking down really at the point of attack and putting all 9 guys in the box, whatever, trying to stop Mayan Williams, don't you think C.J. Stroud should run some more?
You would think, but I think as long as C.J. Stroud is Ohio State's quarterback, if it isn't broke, don't fix it. Ohio State's offense is plenty sound. It's running like a well-oiled machine with the air in the pass game really at the focal point. They've got good compliments in Mayan Williams, Travion Henderson when they're both healthy. But I think if it's too late in the season for Ohio State to deviate from maybe its original plan, and we've seen what Stroud can do. He's arm first, of course. He's Heisman caliber arm first, of course. And so, we're 2 weeks away from a big Michigan game, and I don't know, maybe Ohio State decides to go C.J. Stroud rushing, number 1 against the Wolverines just to throw everybody off, and maybe even including Jim Harbaugh if he's even thinking that C.J. Stroud's going to run against Michigan. But like I said earlier, if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Right, and that's sort of my point. He's got the Heisman caliber arm. So if you have to respect the run game, which has been struggling, the offensive line has been struggling, the tight ends blocking have been struggling. If you have to respect that aspect of C.J. Stroud's game on the ground, then that can open up a lot of not just read option, but RPOs as well. And then you saw what Ohio State was able to do against Penn State in the fourth quarter especially. It'd be the play action, just a little pop pass across the middle, get the ball into your playmaker's hands, and you're off to the races. So, if C.J. Stroud is able to keep it for maybe 1 or 2 runs at least, maybe a designed run in there, that has to keep that defensive end a little bit more honest and hang out there just to prevent that quarterback pull to go for – it doesn't have to go for 15 yards every time. It doesn't have to go for 44 like he ran against Northwestern. You just got to get 6 yards, right? Just a couple yards here and there and chunk plays. Maybe that'll open up the inside zone run for Mayan Williams or Travion Henderson when he comes back from injury. I think it doesn't have to be the main part of Ohio State's game, because with the J.T. Barrett, Urban Meyer offense, it would drive me crazy when Ohio State was down or they needed a win and everybody knew in the stadium if it was 4th and 1, J.T. Barrett was getting the ball. Who knows if he was short or not? Hey,
Whoa.
that's up for debate.
Whoa.
I personally think he was, but hey, that's not. Yeah,
Shooting from the hip here.
I know, but no, it's got to be a little bit part of Ohio State's offense going down the road.
And the answer is it should. But this game was telling because it wasn't about C.J. Stroud's ability to run. It was more so about the offensive line's ability to get absolutely beat by good effort. Number 99 for Northwestern was eating all day in the interior of that line. And
Cade Stover on a couple blocks as well.
Cade, but we've seen those guys, Cade Stover and the linemen, play well against, those other teams. Maybe not so well against Iowa or against Northwestern or against Penn State in the run, which is very interesting because that's the caliber of defense they're going to find when, that team comes down from Ann Arbor for November 26th. They're going to have to deal with a defense that is going to be attacking and plugging holes like no other team has done so far. And I think it's interesting you bring up C.J. Stroud maybe needing to run more. If you're taking chunk yardage from your quarterback on the run, that means he's getting hit or he's sliding. And he's making another decision that he hasn't made in the last 2 years very frequently. So if you're playing Michigan, you're asking him to make another read, another mental decision to try to beat that good defense. And you're also taking the ball out of your better runners' hands if your line would just block and open holes for them. At the same time, the conditions, who knows what they're going to be November 26th, but
I was just looking up the weather report.
It's probably going to be cold. And it's probably going to be a game where you have to dominate the trenches. In order to win that game, you have to win the offensive and defensive line. And right now, I don't know if Ohio State is in a position to confidently say they can do that, control the game, and beat Michigan, even at home.
Right. I was watching a video from Joel Klatt earlier today, and he was talking about how everybody in Columbus is going to be looking out for the weather report because the game last year was affected by snow and weather. The game last week was affected by wind and rain and weather. So I'm looking at the weather report up to Tuesday, November 22nd. So the week of the game.
You can't even get the game.
I know.
Right
I don't have Weather Forecast Premium. I only have the standard package. So
wow.
Up to the 22nd, the high is 50, the low is 34, 22% chance of precipitation and partly cloudy. So, I mean, who knows what it's going to be the day of the game. The point is, like you said, you got to control the trenches and you have to play physical football. But has Ohio State shown that recently they can play that physical football? You can see sort of their ceiling of what Ohio State can be and just an absolute dominant physical force. But their floor is a lot lower than Michigan. So, I mean, Michigan's floor is higher than Ohio State in my mind.
Michigan's floor in their ability to run the ball and control tempo is much higher, but I think Ohio State's potential. The ceiling is the roof for Ohio State. The ceiling is, the floor for this Michigan offense in what we've seen from J.J. McCarthy and dominating opponents through the air and him making reads against detailed defenses. So we'll have to see, especially on the road, what that looks like in terms of a Harbaugh-called offense. And we talk about, C.J. Stroud running. Did they pull that out of his Michigan playbook a little early in this Northwestern game? A couple counters that really didn't result in a big gain, but some other looks that kind of resembled something that looked more towards that Urban Meyer era at Ohio State.
We're talking a lot about November 26th, so to bring it back a bit, I don't even want to talk about this weekend, which is Indiana. I want to talk about tonight. So, obviously, over the past weekend, we saw number 1 Tennessee, they fell to Georgia. Number 4 Clemson, they lost to Notre Dame. Interesting. And number 6 Alabama, they went into Baton Rouge and lost in overtime to LSU. So
that was a great game. That was a great game.
Chock full of fantastic games this weekend. And so, honestly, even though Ohio State played its arguably worst game of the season, it couldn't have chosen a better time to do it, because tonight is really going to show what the playoff committee thinks of Ohio State and what the playoff committee considers, more impressive. Because remember, Ohio State is the only team in the nation to win every single game by double digits this season. Granted, you can take that stat with whatever grain of salt you want, but it's a fact. And even though that they've shown basically that they're better than their opponents throughout the course of a game, they haven't really received much love in terms of the number 1 spot. I mean, take, for example, Tennessee. They started the season unranked, and then last week, they're up into the number 1 spot. Ohio State has been either number 2 or number 3 all season. So obvious that, in my opinion, that tells me that the committee thinks there's something left to be desired for Ohio State. And even though Michigan is a few weeks away, I think they still have time to do it against Indiana and against Maryland.
It's because Tennessee, up to that point, had scored the biggest win of the year against Alabama. So that's why they were weighting them as that number 1 team. As for Ohio State, I think they probably didn't value Penn State that highly. They probably figured they were like a 15-ish, like sort of that mid-tier top 25 team, which respectable for Penn State. Notre Dame, they weren't given much value to. In the back half of the season, they've looked a lot better. But it's kind of tough it's so tough when talking about the early season wins and losses that's a totally different team than the team that's playing in November.
But it's the same team. It's the same team.
It's the same team, but you can play a lot different football over the course of a season. You can get better, you can get worse. Texas A&M was right up there at the top 5, I believe, and now they're nowhere to be found. Jimbo's on the hot seat, as hot as ever. So I believe it's hard to judge early season wins, and that's why Ohio State could potentially have one of the best wins of the season, November 26th, if they beat Michigan. But, I mean, for the time being, jury's still out. And Georgia, to me, is the clear-cut favorite because they just scored one of the best wins of the season against Tennessee. And despite Tennessee potentially backdoors open that game, I still think Georgia dominated. I think people can agree with that. So I think Georgia right now is the clear-cut one. There's a debate for 2 or 3, but I don't know. I'd say Ohio State goes down a peg, and they're at number 3, and Michigan's number 2.
And that's where I was headed, Casey. I wanted to ask you guys, where do you think Ohio State ends up after tonight? Because, looking at it from just like Ohio State, they've gotten the job done every single week. There's no reason to penalize them, for winning. But at the same time, Georgia, just looking at their schedule, I mean, we can compare schedules all day between conferences, but you just look, Georgia passes the eye test is what I'm trying to say. And Ohio State has been passing the eye test, but, early in the season, Georgia had their struggles with Kent State, Missouri, and whatnot. But, when Ohio State didn't do that, now they're struggling against, Northwestern, and we'll see how they do against Indiana, whereas Georgia is kind of, woken back up and realized, hey, we're the defending national champions here. We're a good football team. We can dominate games if we want to. And they seem to have figured that out later in the season, whereas Ohio State kind of figured that out early on, and they seem to kind of be losing that edge just a little bit.
Because, I mean, that's kind of the point I was getting at earlier, where nobody cares how you played in September. It's about how you play in November and December. So the committee pretty much is a lot of recency bias. So when those committee rankings come out on that Tuesday, nobody really cares that Ohio State beat Notre Dame 21-10. Notre Dame was a bad team then. Now they're a good team. It's tough to kind of weigh that. But, I mean, the committee has recency bias in their rankings, which that's to no fault of their own. I mean, you have to judge the 4 best teams at that current moment. So I think it doesn't really matter whether Ohio State's 2 or 3 tonight. Obviously, I've already said I think they're 3, but I don't think it really matters because as long as they're in the top 4, if they think they can be the national champion, all you have to do, no matter what, if you're in that top 4, is go win 2 games.
The crazy thing about this is that I think, like you said, these rankings literally do not matter. Week by week, they're solely for entertainment purposes. And that's what makes this so fun, is that you can argue Michigan at 2. You can argue Ohio State at 2. You can argue Ohio State in a neutral site field at a dome could beat Georgia and therefore could be a number 1.
Agree.
That's how I see this. I see Ohio State at a neutral site. They're the number 1. Georgia's the 2. Michigan the 3. TCU 4. But that's not what's going to happen because Georgia, like you said, has the number 1 win. And the only reason that Tennessee was the number 1 was because they beat the number.
Right.
They have a great win over Alabama, which is a good team that now has 2 losses.
Right.
And that no longer matters in what that win was then because we're in another week. So until the end of the year, Ohio State, as we've said all along, controls its own destiny, needs to beat Michigan. The winner of that game might as well Sharpie that guy in as long as they don't lose the Big Ten championship. But there's a case to be made that the loser of that game that does not go to a Big Ten conference championship will have a good chance because USC and Oregon both have a loss as potential Pac-12 winners. TCU has to survive the end of the season. Alabama has 2 losses. LSU has 2 losses. Tennessee has a loss and might not make the SEC championship, likely won't. It's chaos.
Right, and to your point about TCU, just their upcoming schedule right here, they have Texas on the road, a very good Baylor team now. Baylor's really turned the corner on the road, and then Iowa State at home. So it's
Texas is good. Texas is a good team.
Right. They have 3 solid teams remaining on their schedule. So who knows if they even make the Big 12 championship? Right. And they're ranked number 4 in the AP poll, presumably number 4 tonight. But, I mean, that's left to be seen. But they have 3 really tough opponents to end the season, so they might not even end up in the Big 12 championship.
Right, and here's where it gets even wackier. You know, you got LSU, right, and Ole Miss. Who comes out of that side? And if that side winner beats Georgia, do we have a conversation about a 2-loss SEC champion in the mix for a playoff spot? Because you know what? Guess what? They'll have the best win of the season if it's an undefeated Georgia losing the last game before the playoff selection show to an LSU, Ole Miss, or Alabama. So that's when things get really wacky, and that's why this is all fun. Is
Right,
because
I was
there's
about to
so
say,
many
Gabe,
possibilities. But the thing is, it's fun to theorize now. We just need to wait and see how the games play out.
Right.
I think the last people who want to see Ohio State number 3 in the rankings, in the second CFP rankings, is Michigan, and let me tell you why. So I've long said that Ohio State needs a shutout in order to reinforce its resume a little bit. Michigan got that earlier this season. It's gotten a shutout.
Against who?
Against Connecticut. And that's why my next point being not everyone, I can't say everyone, but a lot of people have clamored that Michigan's strength of schedule is nowhere close to maybe even the top half of college football. So you can take that with what you will. But Ohio State, you know, and we talked about this earlier with Notre Dame, Ohio State still had to get up for a top 5 game at the beginning of the season. That's still pretty solid. It beat Penn State on the road. That's a ranked win. They're still undefeated like we've talked about. But I don't think Michigan wants Ohio State to get any more bulletin board material. They've already got the loss from last year, Ohio State. Ohio State's heard a lot about how tough it was and how it lacked it last year in the game in Ann Arbor. If Michigan is number 2 tonight, the Wolverines in 2 weeks in Columbus, if Ohio State's number 3 and behind the Wolverines for the first time this season, that hasn't happened this season. Ohio State hasn't been behind Michigan in the rankings.
Well,
But does Michigan want that to happen?
Jacob, wouldn't you say if they were to play in a game similar to the Northwestern game, minus the wind, if it's weather and stuff like that in Columbus, the odds may shift in Michigan's favor, and they may be the favorite in that game?
I think if we're projecting weather, it's so hard to tell. Northwestern almost won that game on Saturday. I felt almost an upset brewing if the wind would have kept speeding up instead of slowing down and allowing Ohio State to race ahead. Perhaps the Wildcats would be the ones on top, and we wouldn't have the discussion at the moment. But, you know, if you think about an idealized college football weather for the game, you know, I can't even recall the last adverse weather edition of the game.
Last year? Okay, so that's what I'm saying.
Don't forget the 1950 Snow Bowl as well between Ohio State and
I'm
Michigan.
Just saying, you can throw in a little bit of snow and things like that, and I don't think it affects Ohio State's pass game as much as the wind did this last week. But that would certainly seem to play into the Wolverines' hands in terms of running the ball, dominating the defensive line and secondary of Ohio State, and running the ball and controlling clock.
I definitely think the weather conditions at Northwestern were a lot worse than they were in Ann Arbor.
Agree.
But, you know, if it comes down to it, maybe Ohio State's already planning in advance for adverse weather. That's why Ohio State got new turf at Ohio Stadium.
And see, the big thing that people forget is C.J. Stroud went for 384 yards in that game last year. The only problem was Hassan Haskins went for 5 touchdowns. The defense was soft. The offensive line was soft. And that's why Aiden Hutchinson went to New York, because of the recency bias of the Heisman Trophy as well. And, I mean, he played well against Ohio State. That's why he got sent to New York. I'm not faulting him for that. He had a great season. But, I mean, C.J. Stroud didn't really play terrible up in the snow. So if it's snowing, it doesn't matter. It comes down to, can Ohio State get pass rush? Can Ohio State block? And
Can tackle?
Yeah, and I think that's where you get the 4-2-5, and you get Steel Chambers and Tommy Eichenberg being able to tackle. The big thing is, honestly, besides the run game with Blake Corum, I think they'll game plan to take that away. Does J.J. McCarthy start to torch that Ohio State secondary, which has really struggled, and even Sean Clifford kind of picked it apart a little.
All right, so with all that considered, they still have to beat Indiana and then Maryland for that unbeaten matchup of Michigan-Ohio State to happen on November 26th. So, you know, looking ahead to this weekend, Ohio State, they're favored by 40.5 And I picked them to cover the last 6 games. And although they haven't covered the last 2, it feels like, it's either it's due for one or due for the other. So I'm kind of in a pickle right now, but I don't see how Ohio State really struggles with this game, but I don't think they cover 40.5. I think Ohio State wins this game 49-10.
I think that's a bit of an overreaction because I don't know if this Indiana offense can score on this Ohio State defense if they just have to stop a run like that. I think this is going to be, last week I said this was going to be a high-scoring affair, and then Mother Nature said not so fast. I think the Buckeyes are going to try to go out and win this game dominantly. I think I'm going to double down on my last week. I'm going to go 70-10 Ohio State. They absolutely cover. They need, especially if tonight they end up as the number 3, they're going to have that bulletin board material, and unfortunately the Hoosiers are going to come to Columbus and probably become the victim of whatever transpires from that raw emotion.
That's why these score predictions are so much of an anomaly, man. I ate my words last week. But, Ohio State doesn't score 40 for the first time since week 1. And I've said that Ohio State needs to put up 40 in order to, continue its identity there. Kind of like Steven and Gabe have mentioned so far, I still expect Ohio State to have its way with Indiana's defense. If the weather is, favorable Saturday for a change, I see C.J. Stroud really maybe focusing on getting the pass game back up to speed after really having to focus on the run game. It's a really different-looking Indiana offense compared to what we've seen in recent years, and, that 2020 Ohio State-Indiana matchup was outstanding, and it's unfortunate the fans couldn't see that. But,
I don't think the fans would have wanted to see that, Jacob.
T.Y. Mullen is still back there with that Indiana defense. I think he gets an interception this weekend. If you're going to give C.J. Stroud one, pencil that in, maybe. And then for Ohio State offensively, we talked about C.J. Stroud centering the offense. I think he probably throws for at least 4 touchdowns, gets back going with the passing game. Ohio State wins this game 47-13.
Yeah, I mean, you take away that 2020 game where it was just decided by a touchdown, and Ohio State's won by 21, 28, 23, 41, and 47, going back to, I believe, 2016. And with Indiana starting quarterback Connor Bazelak, he was left with an injury, and then Jack Tuttle came in against Penn State last week. He left with an injury. Tom Allen said he'll be back this week. I think Ohio State, they just kind of outmatch Indiana. I'll never forget, I believe it was the second quarter. It was before halftime, being up on the rainy camera deck over there in Bloomington at Memorial Stadium and seeing the headlights and the taillights of the cars already leaving before halftime. That game was a blowout, and I expect much of the same. This week's weather, we're getting some Friday night rain in Columbus here, Friday afternoon rain. 100%. So get your raincoats for Friday. Maybe a little bit of wet turf overnight. Rain might not evaporate, especially in these dropping temperatures where we'll have 42 degrees and 13-mile-an-hour wind.
Correct, it might freeze. Right.
Right. So I think Ohio State, they win 48-6.
All right, so after that weather report from Casey, that will be episode 11 of the Lantern Sports Podcast. For Casey Smith, Jacob Benge, and Gabe Burggraf, I'm Stephen Kishpaugh, and we'll see you in the next episode.